Welcome everyone. Looks like we're reaching a audience that's kind of starting to stable off, so maybe we'll get started. Thank you all for taking time to be here with us tonight. We're super excited to have this audience and this amazing panel come together on a Thursday night that I know is 9 p.m. for some of our panelists and 6 p.m. for others of our panelists. So we really appreciate it. For wherever you're coming across the world. We want to welcome you to the second iteration of ChaiTime. ChaiTime was is a webinar series that was made starting in May by the Harvard Iranian Alumni. And this is going to be its second iteration of it. My name is Parsa Erfani, and I'm not an alumnus yet, but I'm a medical student and one of the organizers of the Harvard Iranian Summit. And I'm excited to be joining you all tonight as the moderator. So with that, I'll pass it off to Sahar, who will introduce herself.
So hi everyone, I'm Sahar, and I am a designer and creative and a part of the Harvard Iranian alumni community. And I'm also super happy to be here with our panelists and our moderator Parsa. And I will be helping with tech and Q&A questions for tonight's panel.
Awesome. Thank you, Sahai-Jan. So since our first ChaiTime session back in May, we faced difficult weeks and months as we once again witness the killing of Black people by police in the United States. As the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor have become center stage in our national rhetoric, we found it necessary to use our platform to take a pause and discuss our role in supporting Black Lives Matter. Tonight, we're joined by three phenomenal panelists to discuss anti-Blackness in our communities and think about how we can integrate anti-racist work in our personal and professional lives on a daily basis. Our conversation tonight will be specifically on anti-racism in the United States. Although we'll touch on the roots of anti-Blackness as Iranians, this hour will not focus on racism towards Afro-Iranians or other racial or ethnic minorities in Iran, all of which are worthy of their own discussion. And before we get started, I want to acknowledge two things. One is that we see this panel as part of a larger mobilization in our community around organizing around anti-racism. And we want to stress the importance of both our organizations and our partner organizations in including and uplifting the voices of Black Iranian Americans. Secondly, we wanted to acknowledge that speaking about race and racism can be hard and sometimes uncomfortable, so we avoid it. Tonight, our goal is to start making the uncomfortable comfortable, and I think our panelists will give us the vocabulary and background to do that. The first hour of the program will be a discussion with our panelists based on questions you've all submitted, so thank you for doing that. And at the end of the panel, we'll leave about 15 to 30 minutes after the hour for some questions that you guys can submit live. And maybe I'll actually pass it off to Sahad, who will explain how to submit questions during that hour, and will also introduce our panelists for us.
Thank you, Parsa. During the hour, we will be accepting questions on the Q&A box located on the bottom of the page. And we will be collecting them, and we will try to get to as many as we can by the end of the panel. And thank you to our panelists for taking the extra time to answer any questions. We really appreciate it. I also want to note that this panel will be recorded and posted on our YouTube page for future viewing. And we also know that the conversation is not going to end here, and we will be sending a package of resources for the reading recommended by our panelists and our team to all of you who registered for this event. And finally, I would like to introduce our panelists. So Dr. Niaz Kasravi is an expert and advocate on criminal justice, social justice, and racial justice, with 18 plus years of experience leading campaigns, including those on police accountability, racial profiling, and death penalty abolition. Dr. Kasravi is the founder and director of the Avalon Institute, a research, advocacy, and training institute. She previously served as the director of criminal justice program at the National Association for Advancement of Colored People and associate for the Domestic Human Rights Program of Amnesty International USA. Dr. Kasravi holds a PhD in criminology, law, and society from the University of California, Irvine. Our next panelist, Bianca is an award-winning podcaster, actress, and writer based in Los Angeles. Originally from the Bay Area, she was raised by her Iranian father and Afro-Panamanian Colombian mother and studied international marketing and German. Since living in LA, she's worked steadily in the entertainment industry and hosts a podcast with Neil Brennan called How Neil Feel, a podcast on race and dating that has now been named one of the best comedy podcasts of 2019. And our final panelist, Dr.Neda Maghbouleh, is an international expert on racial identity formation with a strategic focus on Middle Eastern and North African immigrants and refugees in North America. Her award-winning first book, The Limits of Whiteness, Iranian Americans, and the Everyday Politics of Race, was published in 2017 by Stanford University Press. In July 2020, she was tenured and promoted to Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Toronto, where she leads the RISE team, a major 5-year study of integration and well-being among Syrian newcomer refugees. She was born in New York City and raised in Portland, Oregon, and she now lives in Toronto with her husband and her 6-year-old daughter, Nidu. Thank you to our wonderful panelists for joining us today. We really appreciate your time. And I'll send it back to you, Parsa Jan.
Awesome. Thank you, Saharjan. Really excited to have you guys, Bianca and Neda, Niaz. Really grateful that you took time to be here tonight and talk to us. So I want to begin with a theme that came up in a lot of the questions we got, which is around how anti-Blackness manifests in our Iranian American community. And I know, Neda, you've in your book written a lot about how the experience of immigration of the Iranian American community has influenced the way they perceive race and view race. And Bianca, you talk a lot about in your podcast the kind of difficulty around navigating race and tiptoeing around race and feeling uncomfortable or like being PC. So I was wondering if we could start with you guys and ask, in your experiences, in your personal life and in your careers, what comes to mind when you think about anti-Blackness and racism in the Iranian American community? Neda,
Yes,
Neda.
Okay.
Doctor?
Thank you. Thank you also just to Harvard Iranian Summit for organizing this. The two co-panelists, I'm like super geeked out because I'm fans of Niaz and Bianca to the max. So this is really exciting. Now, the question, Parsa John, that you posed, it actually is exactly the connection between how my personal life has influenced my career. Because, I promise I'm not going to go on too long, but it really started because of, I think, something that a lot of the participants who have joined us on the Zoom might relate to, which is I was born in the US. And so I absorbed like a sponge all of the clues and the cues around me about race and racism here in the US. Well, I'm technically in Canada right now, but I mean like when I was growing up in the US. So I think at a very young age there, you learn that race is like both the fundamental way that the economy and the society are organized. And then hopefully as you grow up, also in the US, you will hear at some point that race is also a biological fallacy, right? That like race is not real, it's been an invention. And so for me, it was always kind of balancing that like I saw evidence of race and how consequential it was in people's lives. But as I grew up, I kept hearing a colorblind sort of ideology or, the real sort of scientific truth that race is not an actual biological fact. So at the time that I was beginning to put all of this together as a child, I was also absorbing some secondhand messages about who Iranians are in the middle of all of this. And so, many of the messages that I was hearing as a kid are what academics now call the Aryan or the Aryan myth. And I think also some of the participants on this Zoom, like, you will know some of the axioms that form the myth. I'm going to name like 8 of them right now, but there are others too. But hopefully, like, the things I'm going to say, you're going to connect to them and be like, oh yeah, I heard a khale or like a problematic amu say this. You know, one, like the word Iran comes from Arya or Aryan. 2, that the Persian language is one branch on the Indo-European language tree, which means that then Iranians possess some sort of biological or cultural similarity to Europeans. You know, 3, that Zoroastrianism was an antecedent for Western Christianity. 4, that, you know, Western like art, culture all go back to the Persian Empire, that the modern notion of human rights traces back to Cyrus in 550 BC, that today's white Europeans are in fact actually migrants who left Iran many, you know, millennia ago, that the existence of recessive traits among the Iranian population. So when you have that cousin with like the mubur, the blonde hair, or the light eyes, that you know is some sort of glimpse into what Iranians used to look like before Arabs and others invaded the land. And finally, you know, that all of these notions that form the Aryan myth or the sense of Iranians Aryai, that these are also like somehow pure and they operate independently from race and ideologies that circulate among like Nazis and white supremacists and others who use similar kinds of vocabulary. So all of these things together form this sort of backdrop for what Iranian immigrants bring with them to the United States. So I want to say that it's important to note that like all of this supposed evidence about the Iranian Aryan myth, it's been debunked by historians. The kind of scientific truth behind it has been debunked by geneticists and a variety of other scientists. We can find in the research that this myth that's supposedly from millennia ago is actually just an invention of the past 150 years from the Qajar era, but it's been sustained by political elites in diaspora and in Iran from every regime since the Qajar era. And these regimes actually are kind of in opposition to each other, and they don't have a lot of things in common, but they actually have a very deep connection to this sort of nationalist Iranian Aryan myth. And so the goal really in the past 150 years has been to erase or mute diversity among Iranians. And this includes, of course, Afro-Iranians among so many other minority groups. And it was really meant to put Iranians within a bigger global politics that's been defined by racial capitalism across centuries. So finally, when you bring all of these things together, the sort of US ideology of white supremacy, the Iranian ideology of the Aryan myth, what is whiteness if it's not always in relation to Blackness, and in this situation, an anti-Blackness? These are all like fundamentally chauvinistic, but they sort of have the same roots. And so I think that my personal life and my career have been in the service of trying to understand, like, why are we so addicted to this myth of whiteness, both in US society, but also as Iranian people? I see it really as a kind of system level delusion and drug. And as individuals, we may show symptoms or cravings for it, but it goes much deeper than the individual level. So as a society, we are absolutely addicted to anti-Blackness. We are addicted to the way that it doles out certain resources to some people and it revokes them from other people. And as Iranians, because we have enjoyed many benefits, we may be in some quarters people of color, but nonetheless, as non-Black Iranians, for those of us who are, you can't really understand our anti-Blackness without understanding like all the places we've lived across a very wide swath of time, and all of the people who have at different times been included or excluded from the Iranian nation. So sorry for the long-winded answer, but yeah, there's just so many different ways that Iranians, I think, can tap into this question.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think, John, I think that that trope of the Iranian myth that you talk about is something that I heard so much growing up, and it was such a thing that was constantly like taught to me that I didn't, as a young kid, I didn't really know that we had Afro-Iranians in Iran or other racial minority groups. And it wasn't until like I watched a film in which I saw an Afro-Iranian that I started to learn about that and read more about it. And I think it's like it totally erases the existence of Black people inside Iran, and also the existence of the history of slavery inside Iran, that we often also ignore with that myth. So thank you. I think that was like a really interesting to hear the kind of history behind it. Um, Bianca, maybe we can go to you and kind of hear about how you, in your work and in your life, have seen anti-Blackness in the Iranian American community.
For me, it's two parts. It's one, what I think and what I feel, and the other part, what I've experienced as, a Black Iranian. For me, I do understand. So, okay, for example, Iranians' history in America started relatively recently. So most of the time, 70s, and for the most part, 79. Whereas, Black Americans' history in this country started hundreds of years ago. So you have this history where this country was positioned for economic prosperity on the backs of Black people. And because of that economic prosperity is the reason why there are Iranians in this country, amongst many immigrants. And so because the history of Black people go back so much farther, they have had to pay the price for every right they have had up until this point. And so they've almost paved the way for immigrants to come here and be relatively safe. Iranians came here and they were, for the most part, fine. I'm not saying they didn't face persecution, but they weren't killed. They weren't hunted, So this is all on the backs of Black people. And when immigrants come here, I think the guidebook really is for assimilation into American culture is you adopt kind of white America's view of things and their value system and their outlook of things. So when you're told, oh, Black people are lazy and they aren't, pick yourself up by the bootstraps sort of thoughts. My dad came here and he had to work so hard. A lot of immigrants come here. They don't know the language. They don't know the culture. Everything is working against them, and they still they carve out some sort of financial independence for themselves in the end. And they look at an American, let's say a Black American, they're like, the language, the culture, you have it easier than I had it. And somehow still I can gain some sort of economic prosperity. I understand why there is that the Black community, the stereotypes continue on, even when immigrants come and then they're like, yeah, I totally get, they kind of adopt this white outlook. But what they don't realize is that it's so rigged against them, and no one wants to say that, and no one wants to acknowledge it. So I think if we can acknowledge that there is discrimination against Middle Easterners and Iranians and other immigrant groups that come here, we have to also acknowledge that that is the same system that is discriminatory against Black people. It can't be when I'm an immigrant and I face adversity, or I'm the victim of violence, or I'm the victim of racism or discrimination or prejudice. I'm a gentle immigrant, and I just came here. I'm just trying to make a better life for myself. Why I send my kids to school? I pay taxes. And then you look at the Black person, it's like, pull up your pants, stop being loud, behave, and go to school. And it's like, it's a bit of Stockholm syndrome, because it's the same system, and it's the same system that delivers this same amount of prejudice and hate and discrimination. But when it's not happening to us, and when it's very far away, it's easier to adopt the kind of white supremacist systemic view of Black people. And I think that happens with a lot of immigrant groups. I don't think it's just special to Persian people, but I don't think they realize that Black people have had to pay like such a price and fight for every right they have most of the times with their lives, you know? So when we forget that and we just come in here, and it's interesting because a lot of immigrants come here from oppression and from persecution.
Right.
And from completely unfair, rigged systems. That's why they come. People aren't on holiday. It's not like a French movie where it's like, oh, we lost our return ticket. Oh, where's my scarf? I bump into a guy. We have a coffee. Blah blah blah. It's all, you know, in dire circumstances. But as soon as you come here, it's interesting how we forget, you know. But at the same time, that's really what I feel, and what I've experienced. But at the same time, I'm also Persian. I'm half Persian, and on a local level, on a day-to-day life level, like whether it's like I'm from San Jose, so Sis Devedar is always at this park called Vasona. Whether it's Sis Devedar or where, I don't know, it's like a Persian wedding or something, and my dad brings me and my brother, and people are like Persian people, very accepting of you as Persian. And it's interesting because I say there's a thing in America. It has obviously a disgusting history. It's called one drop rule, and it's basically like a social principle of racial classification. So if you have one drop of Black blood, you're Black. And obviously it has a disgusting history. But I do think of it when I think of Iranians. They're kind of like, if you're a little Iranian, you're like, you're Iranian? Like, yeah, no, I'm Persian. No, yeah. Okay, come. Okay. Say something in Farsi. No. You know, they want you to say something. Blah, blah, blah. But it's just they almost to a fault where they don't see that I'm also not full Persian. It's just like, yeah, you're our team. Come on, join the team. And I think it's because Iran has a really bad PR. They have really bad PR around the world, and especially in America. And so when you feel like your culture is always misidentified and misrepresented, when someone is happy to claim it, I think you're also happy for them to be a part of your culture. You know what I mean? So I feel like Iranians are very excited when someone's Persian or half Persian, or their husband's Persian, or their wife is Persian, stuff like that. So it's a weird two-part thing for me.
Yeah. No, I think, Bianca, you hit on so many great points. I think one thing that really stuck with me was this kind of like, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, and if I can do it, you can do it too. And if Black people aren't doing it, you know, it's because they're not either trying hard enough, or they like being on welfare, or these like really racist tropes that I hear over and over in our community. And I guess, like, I think, you know, it really misses the difference between the racism Iranian Americans experience, the racism Black people experience in the United States. And I think that those are fundamentally different. And, you know, actually, Niaz, like, you've done a lot of work in the, you know, the forms of systemic racism that keep Black people oppressed in this country, like mass incarceration and policing. And at the same time, you've done work around fighting for justice for two Iranian Americans who have been victims of hate crimes in our community. So, like, I'm sure you've experienced, you know, both forms of racism, both, you know, individual racism as well as systemic racism in these two communities. And I wonder, you know, how do you see them being different, given, like, in the work that you've done?
Yeah, it's interesting. When Bianca was talking, it just reminded me of this kind of view of Iranian exceptionalism that we have, and you know, I can't tell you how many times there's been something, you know, like an immigration policy passed that discriminated against us, whether it's like the Muslim ban or, you know, profiling at the airport. And I've really had to sit down with some mainstream Iranian organizations who were advocating to protect our community. And in their messaging, they were saying, you know, well, we're very educated and we're tax paying and we're, you know, so kind of highlighting the accomplishments of the Iranian American community, which we should be proud of, right? But I think what we fail to realize is that in doing that, we're also saying that it's okay if you want to mistreat or take the rights away or discriminate against people who may not have on a societal level the level of education we have or the level of financial prosperity that we have. And, you know, I think we've, you know, I used to work with an Iranian organization, and I came to them after doing advocacy around racial profiling pre and post 9/11. And one of my big things was, how do we get our organizations involved in passing the End Racial Profiling Act? And I was trying to get them to go to those meetings. And what I would hear over and over again is, well, what do we have in common with Black people, right? And so there was a failure to see that. I think as generations are starting to, you know, be born here, grow up here, really feel and understand how those dynamics work in this society, we're beginning to see a shift away from that. But I think to your question of what is the difference and how is it experienced differently by, you know, the Black community versus the Iranian community here in the US, I think the roots of it are very much the same, based in white supremacy and the feeling that whiteness is superior to, you know, other races. But the degree to which the Black community has historically suffered racism, systemic racism, and we'll get to that in 1 second, and the degree to which we experience it, whether it's incidents of hate crimes or police killings in those 2 cases that you mentioned, you know, I can speak to that if you'd like, and the degree and the daily basis and like consistency to which Black Americans experience it in every aspect of their life is very different, right? So the root of it is the same, which is why I'm gonna walk that back, because the reason we should be engaged in this fight is because it's the right thing to do. But I also know that oftentimes to motivate folks, you have to make them understand it's important because it's affecting human beings and it could affect you, right? So I think in the advocacy space, there's always this thing of how do you message this to people? And so in terms of the systemic racism that Black communities experience, it's a historic thing. So you and I think when we were having conversations leading up and with everyone on the panel to this discussion, we talked about the difference between individual biases, acts of discrimination, and then systemic racism. So not me as Niaz, me as an example, can have biased views against Black people. I cannot hire them when I have a position open in my company, right? I can presume that somebody walking on the street is more dangerous than someone else just because of the color of their skin, right? But when I have that power to do that on a societal level, if there are many Niazes leading, you know, the leading companies and organizations and the systems that operate in our community, and have the power to then act on and discriminate against Black people and other people of color to different degrees on that societal level, that's the difference. I think that Black people have experienced throughout, generationally throughout their experience here in the United States. And I think that there's examples of it that kind of really make it hit home, right? When you look at how we got rid of slavery, and then we went to Jim Crow laws, which basically criminalized regular, normal acts when it was done by Black people in this country. And so you create this criminal class, and you look at how criminalization and contact with the criminal justice system has a cyclical impact, not only on family income and wealth, but also on the likelihood of future generations coming into contact with the criminal justice system. Or when you look at how drug laws are enforced in this country, you look at how marijuana laws are enforced in this country, in places where it's illegal, I guess we should say now, that drug use basically is very much the same across races, but who gets picked up by police, who gets sentenced, who gets the prison sentence, and how long that prison sentence is, it's all determined by race. And of course, it's Black people who bear the brunt of that. And you can look at that through all kind of facets of life and in the criminal justice system, whether it's policing, whether it's the death penalty. So I think it's a recognition of what we experience has the same sort of racist and white supremacist root. The reason that a man in a known white supremacist in Orange County felt like he could stab a young Iranian man and get away with it, which thankfully he didn't, but the reasons he did it are the same roots that drive elements of racism and white supremacy in this country, right? The case of Bijan Reza, who was unarmed and was shot by Park police in Northern Virginia, those incidents that the immigration stuff that our community experiences, the laws that discriminate against us have the same root, but the degree to which we as Iranians experience it for a vast variety of reasons is very different than how Black communities experience it. And one thing, I mean, if folks have worked on these issues or are close with, Black families and communities, I started working at the NAACP, and the first thing you learn is that Black families have to have the talk with their kids and really train them over and over again on how to behave if they ever come into contact with the police. And now we've seen over and over again that no matter what they do, they tend to get brutalized and shot, right? So even if they're following the rules, even if they're putting their hand on the wheel, even if they're being respectful to the officer, even when they're sleeping in their own beds, if they're lying on the ground with their hands tied behind them, they still can very likely end up dead. These are things that we in our community don't experience to that extent. So I think it's important for us to realize that. And also, I'll add one last thing. We hear a lot in our community things like, well, I'm not racist, right? I wasn't the one who knelt, or no one from my community, knelt on George Floyd's back, or we don't participate in those things, right? And I think that we're in a moment of time where it's not enough to be non-racist. You have to be actively anti-racist and realize that even if you're not engaging in those behaviors and acting on whatever your own biases might be, which we all have them, you are still part of a system and supporting a system that upholds those things and enables those things to happen. Your tax dollars pay for the police salaries. Who you vote for implements the policies of accountability and appoints the police chief. You vote for sheriffs and things like that. So you have to recognize that you are, even though you might be working on yourself or you have worked on yourself, as folks who call this country home, it is our responsibility to be not just non-racist, but anti-racist, very actively and deliberately.
Thank you, Niaz. And I think that what you were saying around, we're not the ones, Iranian Americans are not the police officers who are going and killing Black people, and that we're different than white Americans or white supremacists. We're more, we have this softer version of racism where it's like we're racist like everyone else is a little bit racist because we're in a racist society. And I think that's, incredibly dangerous. Because often, we talk about implicit biases that we have. And I think one you mentioned was, when you have a Black person walk by you on the subway, that clenching your bag a little bit harder, that form of implicit bias is not, equal to killing a Black person, but it has repercussions in our society. And it reminds me of, I'm in medicine, so I think a lot about health. And back in the early 2000s, these studies came out of a bunch of hospitals where people who had heart attacks showed up to hospitals in the United States. And the time that you show up with a heart attack in the emergency room and end up in the operating room to help take away that heart attack is really important. And when Black people showed up to the hospital versus white people got to that operating room way faster once they stepped into that ED than Black people did. And somewhere in the healthcare field, like I hope and I have trust that, like nurses and doctors and technicians are not trying to not give Black people care, but it's rather this kind of subconscious biases we hold that permeate into all aspects of our lives. And whether it's you're treating patients, or whether it's you're a cop, or whether it's you're just hiring someone, so I think that point is so incredibly important. And I think it's one of the reasons why we all need to be thinking of ways to be anti-racist, and not just police officers or the police department. Yeah.
100%. I just use a lot of criminal justice examples.
Yeah, totally.
I'm living and breathing police accountability stuff these days. So you can apply that to almost every field and every kind of governing societal system that we have in the US. Yeah,
definitely. Niaz, you mentioned the wealth gap that exists in the United States between Black people and white people. And where we're based in Boston, there came out in the Boston Globe a spotlight on race in 2017, and it showed that in Boston, the net worth of a white household was $247,000, and the net worth of a Black household in Boston was $8. Mm-hmm. And those two numbers created a huge backlash in the city, and the city's super segregated. But the similar dynamics exist across the United States. And, as a question to all of you, why, how do we think about this wealth gap, and how does systemic racism play into that? Because like Bianca was saying, it's really easy to just play it off as, oh, people are lazy or people are this, but there's deeper reasons and history behind, and realities of structural racism, why that exists. And I was wondering if you guys could speak to that.
Can I say, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. So, the statistic you quoted about Boston reminds me of this really fantastic law professor. I want to say her name so that people who may not have heard of her work before will hear of it. Her name is Mirza Baradaran. She's a law professor at UC Irvine. She's also Iranian. She is the leading authority on law in Black banking. And her most recent book, The Color of Money, which is a bestseller and it's really making huge waves, really starts with the premise, and this takeaway to me was just shocking and revolting that, in 1863, following the Emancipation Proclamation and the end of slavery, the Black community owned less than 1% of all the wealth in the United States, and that number has not budged since then. So how do we account for that, right? That in 150 years, there is still not a significant increase in Black intergenerational wealth in this country. And so I think as Iranians, we have to be much more thoughtful and critical about the kinds of investments that we're making, the kinds of solidarities that we're forging when we're growing things like businesses, investing in real estate. I mean, any number of things that we sort of champion is we're doing so well in this sector or in that sector, but that's because we signed what the Black political philosopher Charles Mills calls the racial contract, right? It's this agreement among white people that this is working out really well. We hold 99% of the wealth, and we have these signatories that are like junior whites, these like people of color who are not black, but if they also sign on this dotted line, we'll give them pennies. For every dollar that we get to keep, we'll give the Iranians a penny here, perhaps the Asian groups a penny or a couple pennies here, and we can all sort of live by this contract that is fundamentally about anti-blackness. And so I think rather than accept pennies on the dollar for signing this racial contract that protects white people, Iranians have to be much more rigorous right now in the United States. To Bianca's point, we've been here 40 years. If you know better, do better, you know? And so we now have like multiple generations of people who have been living here, who have been born here, who have grown families here. And it's time to make different choices now that we know all of this.
And most of wealth is inherited, right? When you think of that, you realize that unless we're deliberate about flipping that, about who we're supporting, who we're hiring, who we're investing in, it's just going to become a cycle, right? And I'm going to give you one more example, and then I'm going to stop. You know,
Don't stop.
You got me going. And once you get me going on this stuff, you know. So when you think about, let me see if I can play this out in my head as I speak. You think about what's called the school to prison pipeline, right? And you think about how Black students of color, but to different degrees, Black students leading are more likely to get suspended for normal sort of acting out that kids do. And we've all heard of kids under 10 being handcuffed and, you know, called the police on and taken away in handcuffs, and you've seen those videos. Okay, they're more likely to get suspended. Those who are suspended are more likely to be expelled from school. Those who are expelled are more likely to be involved with the system, whether it's a juvenile justice system or the criminal justice system. Once you're involved with the system, not only does your income potential exponentially decrease, so does the potential of your children to be involved with the system. And so if most of wealth is inherited, what kind of system and cycle is that, right? And so it's just, we don't think about these things. We just think, oh, you know, we got here, we worked hard, we pulled ourselves up by our bootstraps, why can't they? We didn't have those cards against us. Our ancestors didn't come here unwillingly and be forced into this, you know, system of slavery and then criminalize and, you know, have this cycle play out generation after generation. And this is why, you know, when you don't understand that, when folks talk about reparations, they're like, oh, you know, they get scared without understanding there is a need to make up for the systems upon which this country was founded, which haunt the Black community and oppress them and take away their rights, even till today, even though you and I might not be racist or actively, knowingly contributing to anything we think is racist. Okay, zip.
But going off what you're saying, I mean, it really does, it is really inherited. And that's why I'm always like a big proponent. Like, I believe in reparations, but I also believe, let's look at what lots of people, like, so take the word reparations away, right? It's like a hot button topic. It's just like, it's a lot of people in America have gotten what we're calling on the government to give Black people. For example, for me, I really feel very passionate about how much the Homestead Act really gave to white families. And it was just an act, like, it started towards the end of the Civil War. And it just allotted like hundreds of acres to people who wanted it, essentially. It was like government land. And I believe it was like, there's like 1.4 or 5 million applicants. The Homestead Act land went to white families, around 1.4 million families, white. I think about 5,000 Black families, you know? And this is like, and it went all the way up until the 30s. So there's plenty of Black people who could use a little bit of land. And a lot of them did. A lot of them were burned down. A lot of them were chased out. A lot of them got the land and then it was just stolen from them. But I do believe, for example, the Homestead Act in this country gave a handout to white and immigrant white families, immigrants, white people, a way to generate wealth for their children and their children's children. And it's like, it generated such an insurmountable amount of intergenerational wealth. And then when we talk about reparations, it's like handouts. It's like, come on, this country is built on handouts and free labor and free handouts and free, essentially. But when it comes to Black people, it's so scrutinized. And it's like, no, Black people honestly don't have a place where they can go and say, I'm going to be treated like equally. I can't. Atlanta, maybe, and not even that. There's not like a place. They don't have a specific place in America where they know for sure that they will be looked at as a human being and treated with all the protections of all the human rights were all allotted. There's not one place they have. So for me, I don't know. I think if we can find a way to give Black people in this country, especially Black people with a lineage back to, slavery, if we can find a way to give Black people that step up and have that, whatever a new Homestead Act looks like that's what I've always thought of in my mind would help. But, I'm not exactly sure. Have you guys thought of what reparations kind of look like?
Well, the city of, is it Asheville?
Asheville, North Carolina, yeah,
just passed a bill, for reparations.
Crazy.
Right? And
yeah,
it's a city that is apparently, it's like, it's a popular city. A lot of tourists go there. It was built by gentrifying Black communities. And so, they're aware of that. And so they don't know what it's going to look like, but they've committed to repairing that harm, whether it's through uplifting and supporting and investing in Black-owned businesses, in supporting families to own property there. So they're trying to figure all that out, but it could look differently based on the needs of particular communities, right? So I think people just get triggered by these words without knowing what it means. I'm not going to get into the whole defund thing. It's the same thing. It's like, you have to look and learn about what our people are saying. What people are saying. I'm sorry, mixing my words up. What people are saying when they say these words that trigger you, rather than just going off the trigger and being like, I think that's where we really lose out in the end, is when we don't dig deep into those things that make us uncomfortable.
Yeah. I think, Bianca, the thing you talked about around being about the people and Black people being excluded from that, like, I feel like we don't even need to go that far back to see when, like, Black people were not invested in. And I think, like, the perfect example that comes up over and over are redlining policies that we had in the 60s, where we literally, like, drew red lines around Black communities. And we were like, these are areas where we will not have public and private investment. Like, we will not get mortgages in there. We will not get loans in there. And I recently saw something for Chicago where it's, like, fascinating, where those redlining policies literally have mapped out what the city looks like today in terms of poverty, in terms of where Black people live. And it's just like, if we've prevented, investment into communities, like, how do we expect those communities to come out with a wealth gap that isn't $8 versus $247,000? Like, where, and then plus, like, I mean, Niaz has done so much work around mass incarceration and, like, talked a little bit about marijuana, but, the war on drugs and the way that has affected and, like, mass incarceration of Black people is another way, like, people have been robbed of wealth and intergenerational wealth. So, I mean, I think you guys, like, really, I don't know, I feel like you've really captured, like, how systemic racism is different for Black people than white people. I mean, Black people and Iranian Americans, and why it's, like, hard to tell Black people to just work harder. you know, just work harder and you'll be where we are. Yeah.
Yeah, if I can just share, it's, I guess, a somewhat light-hearted part of my book. It was a piece of the research that kind of came in at the end that was sort of like a last-minute aha moment that I had, but I was thinking exactly about redlining and the way that we, as Iranian people, have often end up in incredibly segregated residential areas, right? And part of the thing I was playing with in my book was like, how is it that the sort of typical Iranian American family, if you're looking at census tracts, really lives among white people typically, not always, but very typically they're in a census tract with a high proportion of white people. Yet I have all these young people who are participating in my study and they say they feel super alienated and othered, right? When apparently like they have sort of quote unquote like made it into these places where they're not being redlined, they're not being pushed out of, you know, their parents not being pushed out of home ownership in these neighborhoods, yet they feel such a deep sense of exclusion. And so I ended up finding that until very, very recently, through the 2000s, there was this series of restrictive housing codes that were passed in Beverly Hills, which is like the sort of like typical place that anyone who's heard of Persians or Iranians in the US, like they go there, right? They think of like Beverly Hills, like Westwood, and they have that sort of norm image of like the Persian palace in Beverly Hills. So in the course of my research, I learned about how Beverly Hills for, you know, almost 10 years passed these like incredibly restrictive codes that were meant to push out Iranians, like very recently. But because they don't have the mechanism to be able to use redlining as it's been used against Black Americans with financial products, with the support of banks and, you know, mortgage lenders and those sorts of things, Beverly Hills City Council decided to draft this document where they sort of said, you know, Iranian people kind of typically their houses, when they renovate them, they've got these columns and balustrades and ornate wrought iron, you know, and this and that. And we should write the housing code so that we're saying like there's certain kinds of houses that are, we're going to call traditional to Beverly Hills. And they use the term like indigenous, which is so incredibly problematic. But they said, you know, the Spanish casita, the English cottage, like these are the types of homes that we have in our community. And they would use literally terms that were racial. They would say like, these are hybrids, miscegenation, the types of homes that we don't want to have are the ones that are a little bit of this and a little bit of that and the mix and the match. Well, lo and behold, those are the kinds of houses that since the 1980s, Iranian Americans were renovating or building in that community. And so you can sort of chart that it was incredibly effective, that it pushed Iranians out to, you know, of course, still very wealthy neighborhoods in the city of Los Angeles, but they were literally excluded from buying new homes or renovating homes that they may have currently had in Beverly Hills for a really sustained period of time. And that's like very recently. And so it's incredibly creative, right? The different tricks people will do, the different innovations that they'll come up with to practice these forms of exclusion. And so I just mentioned that to say like, this kind of aesthetic racism that's been practiced against Iranians, like that's so low grade. That's like one extremely rich neighborhood in one area of the country. But when you are looking at this bigger systemic thing, I offer that just to say like, even the Iranians, you know, that are perhaps the most white passing or the most well off, like they're still, right, sort of swept up in this bigger white supremacist system. And so we have to start to make these kinds of connections and to practice a more critical and analogical kind of thinking.
Yeah.
And imagine if that happened to us everywhere we went in every aspect of our life.
Exactly.
How angry would our community be, you know? And how would we react to people saying, oh, just suck it up and be law-abiding citizens and do what you're told and you'll be fine, you know? Like, we can't fathom the degree to which Black Americans deal with these issues that impact us to a much lesser degree.
Yeah, totally. I think, you know, they're related and completely different scales and histories and with different roots. Like one goes much deeper than the other. I have not been the best in terms of managing our time. So we only have 5 minutes before we'll go to the live questions, but something that I think came up that's worth mentioning is a lot of questions around how to engage in anti-racism work in your homes, like with your families, in your personal lives. And then additionally, like in your departments, in your companies, in your professional lives, like what does that look like? And it's a hard question because it seems like a lot we've talked about seems like, okay, there is this interpersonal racism, but there's also these like systemic structural things or like implicit biases that we have within ourselves. And, you know, how do you like become anti-racist in these three different things that are seem so sometimes out of our control and sometimes in our control? So I don't know who feels willing to take on this huge question of what anti-racism looks like in the Iranian American community, but the floor is open.
So you're just saying how to talk about it, or how to
in your workplace,
what
like
to do about it. Mm-hmm. Doctors. I'll go really quick and then I'll leave it to the doctors. I think that if we're going to talk about it in our communities, you know, I do think the slogans, for example, Black Lives Matter, is very good for like attention grabbing, but it's not very good in terms of trying to get people to that you want to understand because it's very like, well, Black Lives Matter, and it's meant to be that, and I don't think it should be anything else. But I do think, you know, explaining what that means, because I do think for some immigrant communities, it's like, why does Black Lives Matter? And then you get the All Lives Matter, and then you have to explain, well, if all lives can't matter unless Black Lives Matter, and it can be super easy, or it can, you know, one thing we talk about on the podcast, and Neil brought this up, and now it's kind of a theme. And it's an easy way to get people to understand. It's like, okay, so if across the board, Black lives are cut short through housing, education, in the judicial system, like you name it, we got a statistic for it, right? So you really have two questions. It's one of two things. Either the system's rigged against Black people, or Black people are inferior. They're just born inferior, and no one's going to say Black people are born inferior. One, they're not. Two, no one's going to say that. So then, okay, well, then the system's rigged, and no one wants to say the system's rigged because it feels like it takes, you know, you're the master of your own destiny. You can work hard and figure it out, and no one wants to say something's rigged because it's like, oh, I didn't win that game. It's rigged. It's like, okay, yeah, it's rigged against you. And no one wants to give that any credit. But really, if it's not rigged and the system is not rigged against Black people, then what are you saying? You know? So it really, you kind of have to put it in ways where maybe you're not shouting at someone or like getting into these like weird Facebook screaming matches with old high school friends. But maybe you pose the question, well, if this, then this, you know? So someone can come to their own conclusion and then figure it out on their own. Okay, there's my 2 cents. Now I want to know what the doctors think.
I think that's an incredibly smart way of approaching this. I don't think that there's anything about my work as a professor that makes me more qualified than the really good answer you just gave, Bianca. But I would say, like, just, you know, in my life, I'm trying to do this more, which is like practicing, like taking in new evidence and changing my mind about things, and to share that, right? That like, it's okay to change your mind and behavior after you are presented with new arguments and new evidence. And so I know that things like virtue signaling online and posting all the time on social media, that like that deservedly has a bad rap, that it's like people just being performative allies or this sort of thing. But I do think there's something too, like saying to the people who see us every day, who are engaging with us, like, you know, I was presented with new information. I know things that I didn't know before, and it's okay to change your mind. You don't have to be entrenched in old patterns and to like justify systems that you sort of now know, right, more information about. And so I think we also have to be very like authentic in who we are, no matter what our relationship is to Iranianness. You know, we come in a wide range of mixed or different cultural backgrounds. We have different skin tones, accents, some of us, names that may be suggestive of certain, you know, or they may have certain connotations with them. So I think like Iranians in the United States, like each of us also kind of need to do like a rigorous self-inventory, right? Of like all of the different bundle of characteristics that we have that we're moving through the world with, and to really be not apologetic for them, but to stand in that place with a sense of authenticity, right? You can't know how to navigate the system and how to be tricky and strategic and what tactics to use unless you actually know like where you fit in the system. And that's to some level group work that Iranians as a group must do about our group status, but then each of us as individuals, right, also sort of exist in this continuum within that group. And I think there's a lot of that kind of personal work that people can also engage, while at the same time they're doing this kind of optimistic, careful coalition building with other communities as well.
Do we have time for me to add, or do you want to?
Of course.
Okay, quickly, you know, Neda, what you're saying makes so much sense, and I don't know why we stop doing that once we become adults. Because when we're, you know, in school, we're continuously doing that. We're continuously learning and finding out new things and saying, oh, yeah, I remember. I mean, the reason I do this work is because of my mentor in undergrad and grad school. But I went into her class and I was like, yeah, you know what? I'm not in favor of the death penalty. Yeah, I think the drug war is messed up. You know, yeah, I don't think prostitution should be, you know, like, so we do that. And then as we're growing up, when we become adults, we start to have a problem with realizing, oh, well, and we get defensive about our own biases, you know, and I think it's really important to allow ourselves to be in those uncomfortable moments without trying to deflect and defend. You know, and I think there's a couple of things that was jotting down. I'll ramble off and we can talk about it more. But I think it's a moment for us, as much as definitely is important to have these conversations, to have the messaging out there, to talk to people and have these conversations on social media and personally. Your work should matter, and the impact you're having should matter, even if no one on social media knew what you were doing, right? So if all you're doing is that, then you do fall into that performative category, even though that's an important part of any campaign or any work that you do, right? It's also for us as Iranians, this is not a moment for us to be in the spotlight. This is not a moment for me to like become the advocate I was always meant to be in the larger community. It's a time for us to work in our own communities, to battle anti-Black racism and all other forms of racism, right? So I think we need to do that. In doing that, we need to uplift the voices of Black Iranian advocates who are out there and have been marginalized in these fights within our own community. But I think it's time for us to stand in solidarity with other groups led by Black leadership and listen to them about what they need and show up. And I think the last thing I'll add is this work, whether it's policing, health disparities, whatever, you know, climate justice, economic justice, this is long-term work. The stuff we're seeing in the US did not happen overnight. It did not happen because of Trump. And it will not go away once we have a president who we can stomach better, because we don't have to deal with seeing his rants on TV or, you know, just being embarrassed by stuff he says. This is stuff that's been going on and it's bubbling to the surface and, you know, it's just, you know, coming up, and people are being a lot more bold about it. But everything we've talked about was happening before Trump and will continue to happen once Biden is in power. I said once, I don't know why. If, maybe I should say, because who knows, but whatever the case is, these are not issues that are going to go away by switching administrations or elected officials. Those are steps that'll help, but it's a very long-term battle. And if we become obsessed with these band-aid solutions and things that allow us to sleep better at night because they don't affect us directly, like we're part of the problem.
Yeah, totally. And I think Bianca said it like perfectly before, where the reason why we have the freedoms we have here today as Iranian Americans is on the backs of Black Americans who fought for
100%.
civil rights. So not only is it the right thing to do for Black people to have human rights in this country, but we're indebted, I think, to that. And it starts in our families, at our dinner tables, at our Nowruz events, and just saying no, and not being a bystander to racism in our own families and communities. So yeah, thank you for the answers to the final question that I didn't give that much time to, but I think was incredibly important. We've been getting many questions in the live chat, so maybe I'll pass it off to Sahad, who will share some questions. Hopefully we'll get to some of them.
Thanks, Parsa. So before we take Q&A questions, I just want to remind everyone again that this session is recorded and will be posted onto our YouTube page. And that link will be emailed to all of the guests who registered for the event, as well as a package of resources for further reading. So we've got quite a bit of questions. I'm gonna go ahead with the first one. So we have someone saying, I wonder if part of the challenge is the lack of integration of Iranians and Black communities, and maybe even integration is too much to expect. Maybe it's even just meaningful interactions between the communities. Any thoughts on what we can do to change that and in a way that is genuine and meaningful? Pass that to Neda, June.
Sure. If I come at it from a researcher perspective, the kind of social distance that I think the person who asked the question is alluding to, right? That maybe there's a lack of integration, whether that's, Iranians and Black Americans perhaps sharing a neighborhood or a workplace or a school setting. Like, I don't know exactly what they mean, but in any way that you would measure social distance, the research is actually kind of like iffy on whether proximity to people who are different than you actually ends up influencing the character, the flavor of the relationship, the nature of the feeling between the two people, right? So oftentimes we think like, oh, prejudice and discrimination can be overcome if we just like created more environments where different people were interacting with each other. And the research is a little bit kind of like inconclusive about whether or not that is super helpful. And that's because we are all part of like much bigger systems with these controlling images, whether you think about the media or politics or whatever it is, like even having deeper interpersonal connections with people from different racial backgrounds still does not necessarily overcome these larger ideological messages that we're getting in other spaces too. And so I think we can think about, ways that we can create more diverse and inclusive environments for Iranians and others to like connect to one another, but it is really going to take a much more systemic top to bottom kind of overhaul of the educational system, of the messaging, of all of it to affect, I think, the kind of change that someone who's equity seeking, like I think the person who answered the question, to get to that place.
And can I add something? Are we showing up as individuals or even our organizations or groups that represent pockets of the Iranian American community when stuff happens? Do we show up when a Black person is killed in LA, or do we only show up when a hate crime happens to a member of our own community? I think these are difficult questions we have to ask ourselves. And so the answer is we haven't shown up. The reason we were able to get a diverse coalition to support Shayan Mazari's hate crime case and Bijan Qesai's police killing case is because I'd been working with those communities, and the families were open to reaching out and wanting support and have showed up for those communities themselves. But we don't do that on a regular basis. And I think it's time to do that as individuals and then demand that organizations that represent our communities do so in a not just issuing a statement, but actually showing up to the advocacy and to the organizing space, you know? And I think the last thing I'll add is all of that is important. The integration, the, you know, diversity and things like that are important. But then it goes to like, what is a real long-term solution versus a Band-Aid solution? We talked about this in some of our prep discussions where you look at like the police, I go back to policing again, the police department in New York, which is a majority minority department, right? So mostly people of color. Do they still engage in racial profiling? Yes. Do they still have a huge problem with stop and frisk? 100%. Do they still brutalize communities of color? Yes. So it goes beyond the integration and diversity piece to really a way of thinking and acting across systems, you know, individually and across systems.
Thank you. And this next question is directed for Bianca. So someone's asking, is there something to be said for when comparing an immigrant's attainment of prosperity in America to those of Black Americans, that immigrants like Iranians are starting from a baseline of 0, i.e. starting with nothing, whereas Black Americans are starting from a negative point by way of systemic oppression over centuries?
I think you said the thing. But basically, yeah. I mean, also, I do think as an immigrant, you come here and it's so new and you try to navigate your way. And I, like I said before, I don't think they realize it's hard when you're having a hard time to realize, look at a Black American and realize, even though it feels like the world's against you as an immigrant in this country, it still isn't rigged against you as hard as it is rigged against Black people. And it's very hard to constantly tell yourself, like, I have it easier than someone. I mean, it starts feeling like that. It starts feeling like you're giving people excuses and stuff like that. But really, this country is more open to white looking immigrants than they are to Black Americans in terms of like systemic oppression. So I think what he said is true. I'm not sure what the question part was. Whereas, is there something to be said? Yeah, I think we said it.
And I guess we have a question on the history of Blacks in the south of Iran. Someone's asking or commenting that they're appalled that they didn't know anything about them until they visited Bandar Abbas. So they're asking, do other Iranians not know they exist, or do they deny that we can be anything other than Aryan? Neda, June, or?
For people who are interested in learning about, the multi-ethnic history of Iran, like I'll just offer the names of a few scholars that they can Google. Like there's a lot of documentary research and photography and documentary films that have been produced. But people that I can sort of say, like, I think their scholarship is 100% and it's like really rigorous and well done would be the historian Bita Baghoulizadeh. She's a professor of history and Africana studies at Bucknell University. Her work is about the legacy of slavery in Iran, and she uses a variety of different kinds of family archives and historical methods and different forms of data to excavate this history. And she does it in a really, really careful way that is also attentive to like global anti-Blackness too. And so I love Bita's work, and I would really recommend people check out, like, she's done interviews and podcasts about her research. And so there's a lot to be learned by following her work. And then also there's another historian named Rasmus Ealing who has a book about ethnic minorities in Iran that is stellar. And so he does a very comprehensive kind of an overview that also, of course, touches on the denial, as the person who wrote the question said, you know, do we deny that we can be anything other than Aryan? So he really gets really nicely into that and the suppression of the very like incredibly diverse and plural society that Iran had been for centuries. So check out Rasmus Ealing and Bianca Maghbouleh for more on that.
Thank you. We have another question. Says, I find that the trauma my parents experienced in immigrating to the US in the late 1970s has given them more reason to assimilate and adopt white supremacist and oppressive ways of thinking. How can you make sense of, come to terms with trauma that exists with the Iranian diaspora and its relation to anti-Blackness? Niaz?
Well, it's interesting. I think that Neda probably has a lot to add on this too, but to me, what I thought about when I was thinking about that question is that, okay, I understand and I have seen the trauma she's talking about and the propaganda that generations were exposed to and the experiences they had in Iran during the Revolution War immigration experience. So and whether or not they buy into the Aryan myth or not, right? So I understand that's a whole thing. Well, whether you think you're white or not should not have an impact on you wanting to be anti-racist, right? So even if you think you're white, this is an obligation. And I don't see the two things as completely, so I feel like there's a whole thing to unearth about challenging them on their personal views of being white or not. And then there was a whole other thing around working on being anti-racist. You know, I don't think, it might make it more difficult, but I don't think it's like mutually exclusive. Whereas if you think you're white, you by default can't be anti-racist. I'm not sure I understand the question right. I'm not sure I'm expressing what I'm saying properly. But I think those are two different things. Challenging their notions of, yes, I'm white, unless they've completely bought into the white supremacist myth, which is, you know, the same work we'd be doing in white communities then, right?
Another question. Someone says, I am a strong believer in allowing people to learn from their mistakes along with transformative and rehabilitative justice. However, I also believe that people should be held accountable for their mistakes and comments that have hurt people and contributed to upholding racist and anti-Black systems. How do you balance the act of forgiveness with accountability and encourage those who have made hurtful statements or actions to re-educate themselves? Bianca, I will pass it to you.
I guess in terms of family, I think this happens probably more within family and extended family and stuff like that. I think as a country, we're going through a weird time because I do think the Trump administration, although none of this is new, really did shake up families all across America, you know, young versus old school versus new school. Like, I think a lot of white people realizing their parents qualify as racist, you know, things like that, or not even white people, you know, and it happens in immigrant families too. And so I feel like there's this divide right now in the country. And now you add the divide of, you know, who thinks coronavirus is like real, mask, not mask. And now we're adding now just how racist this country is has come to the forefront, you know. And I think we're having to figure out how to navigate through a lot of conversations right now. But I do think the nice thing is right now, the nice thing about all of this is that no one can say, like, what are you talking about? Like, what racism? Like, it is very hard to dismiss all of these. It's very hard to dismiss the divide within our households right now. So that's good. So that's a starting point, because at least everybody, even like everywhere from grandma to a kid, we can talk about these things. I think within, let's say, my Iranian family, it's important to just really try to translate things in context, and try to get people to understand things in context. But the problem is, this is in terms of my family. Sure, I'm going to work with my family, but if this is just someone being ignorant or saying something racist or hurtful, I don't know. I'm not sure how much of a responsibility we have to teach that person, or it's just kind of like, look, if you're not part of the movement, like, get out the way, because a lot is happening. So I do struggle with figuring out how much of your own energy to give to what. Yeah, my uncle's like saying something stupid, sure, I'm going to talk to him. But if it's something online, or if it's a friend, like, I don't know how much bandwidth we have these days. And I don't know how much I want to convince someone that there really is racism and systemic racism. I don't want to, like, does Niaz want to give her whole like thesis to some Joe Schmo on the street? Like, no, so I don't know the right amount of effort and energy to take from myself to put onto other people to get them up to speed. I guess I kind of want to know what everyone else thinks, especially the doctors, like, because you guys do specialize in something. You're the doctors to me, my beautiful doctor
Get
girls.
my scalpel.
Doctor, paging Dr. Niaz. I want to know, when you say, oh, I'm a doctor, and your background, do people come to you? Do they come to you guys and want to debate? Do they bait you in conversations? Do they try to show you that, I don't care that you have a doctorate, like, you're not right about that, like, how much energy do you guys give to that? Side question.
I think it's so tricky. Like, right now, there are so many people that want to engage in bad faith debate and arguments, and the goal is not to even change your mind or their mind, but they're there to like exhaust you and to sap your resources and your energy. So I don't think this is necessarily right, but I do like really protect my energy and my time by surrounding myself to some extent with like-minded people. It doesn't mean that we feel exactly the same way about all issues, but like I'll tell you, like, I do have a cocoon. I live in a bubble, and I've curated it that way, and I'm very intentional about when I leave my bubble. And I feel that that's like a duty that I have, given the career that I have and the work that I do and the political commitments that I do. But I have to say, like, I do that on my terms, right? Like, I say to myself, okay, I'm going to give, just for example, like a talk in a Persian community center that has a wide variety of people that have different political outlooks and, perhaps demographic characteristics, but I engage going into it, like, knowing that that's what I'm signing up for. And I do it in some way, like, kind of on my timeline and my schedule. Maybe that's too much information to share, but I just want to say to people on the call that are really invested in doing anti-racist work within our community, you have to have like your community of people that you can go to, that you don't have to explain this to from Jump Street. You don't have to start from ground zero. And you have to hold them tight and protect those relationships that you have with people, and then keep each other honest about how you need to like make the bubble bigger sometimes, right? To keep the message and to keep the momentum and the movement going. But I do believe like we're in a place right now where we've got to like make those connections. And I think the resource list that the organizers of this event, the exit package they're going to be sending out will have like really important little breadcrumbs for how people can find each other. Because right now the goal is like we all are living in different places. We're sort of, you know, far away. COVID has made that abundantly clear that we may not see one another in person for a very long time. And so it's about like, how do we network from the place where we stand today and find each other and build with each other?
Yeah. Totally. I think, you know, the question of what non-performative anti-racism work looks like is really difficult. And I think everyone is being confronted by it. I had a friend who was messaging me today being like they had a conference at her job where around anti-Blackness and Black Lives Matter movement, and every single person in the room but her was white. And just, you know, looking around you, whether it's like where you live, your friend group, like your job, and it's like when you're in these spaces and you see that there's Black people like aren't invited to be there, I think it's just a moment to think about like why, you know, and what's my role in it, and why am I here, and what power do I have, and what privileges do I have that I'm sitting at this table, and how can I use that? And I think, I don't know, I struggle with that question a lot, and I think Bianca and Neda and Niaz, like throughout this whole time, have talked about like it's hard to figure out how, but we have an obligation and a responsibility to like work really hard to do that because of our stories and our lives and the privileges we do hold. So with that, I want to thank our three panelists. I know we're hitting time. We so much appreciate your time, especially Neda, who's hitting 10:30 p.m. for her on East Coast time.
Yeah.
And Bianca, I think, you know, what I loved about this panel was Neda's a sociologist, Niaz is you know, an advocate, a social justice advocate, and does research, and Bianca is an actress and podcast host, and like, you know, anti-racist work is not the work of one profession. It's everyone's, every sector. And like, you guys brought that in so many different angles. And I think that's like what I'm going to take away from this is, this is all of our work. And it's really time to mobilize. It has been time to mobilize, and now more than ever. So very grateful for you three, and also the Harvard Alumni Board, and for making this a platform where we can have this conversation and bring our community together. It's like, I'm incredibly grateful for them as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.
To add, we will make sure to mention the scholars that Neda Jun was talking about in the exit package, because a lot of people were asking. And I also wanted to ask, thank all of our guests for attending, and also please follow the Harvard Iranian Alumni Association Instagram page at Harvard Iranians for any updates and future events as well. And again, thank you again to all of you.
Thank you, Sahajum.
Thank you, Parsa.
Bye, guys.
Guys, good night.
Good night.